If you've got an hour to practice, how best do you use it? How do you organize your time? Let's craft a good plan together. Today, I'm going to give you an outline of my practice schedule and routine. Routine is a loaded word, but it's going to apply here, at least as far as the structural pillars of our practice. So I'm going to give you a 3-point plan that I use to organize my hour. We're going to go through it piece by piece with recommended exercises. And all the technical and tone study exercises that I use in my own practice and I'm recommending today, you can download for free in our fundamentals book. So you have basically everything you need to get a great hour of practice in. So every practice session for myself and my students, I recommend hitting the 3 pillars: tone, technique, and artistry. Whether you're practicing jazz, improvisation, or classical, the concepts remain the same. And that's where the routine comes into play. The routine is hitting all 3 pillars, not the exact exercises. In fact, with my students, I vary the exercises at least every month, sometimes more often. Only one exercise remains persistent throughout all my practice for the past several years, and I'm not changing it. And we'll cover that as well, and some frequently asked questions at the end, room for variations in your own interpretation. But let's dive in immediately to the first pillar that I recommend you start your practice with: tone. Whatever tonal concept you're chasing, and it's highly subjective and personal to taste, there are some core truths, including control, resonance, and flexibility, and coloration, or what we call voicing, that's going to help you achieve that sound. Now, of course, listening is the first and primary key component to having a great sound. Beyond that, and we'll cover that in future videos, and I've covered that before, the exercises to achieve that, I'm going to break it down into 3 sections: exercise 0, overtones, and tone studies. So first, right off the bat, all my students and myself, I have been doing this for years, I start with exercise 0. Now, I have an entire video on exercise 0, the why, how, probably not the where. You should figure out the where yourself and the when. But the why is to open up the embouchure and the airstream, staying relaxed. We calibrate our entire instrument and way of playing to low B flat. The resonance, projection, and control that you're going to experience starting with that and many months later are going to pay off in spades. So I'm not here to make the argument for why exercise 0, but you will find it in the workbook. It's a free exercise. Why not at least try it for a few months and see what it does for your sounds? I've had students that have cursed my name and then end up sending sheepish apology messages like, all right, I admit it's really helped my playing. So start with exercise 0. It calibrates our playing to everything else. Second, a tone study. Now, you notice I didn't say long tones. I don't practice long tones as such. I always consider them part of tone studies. And I'm really not diving into semantics. You could say, yes, but long tones are a tone study. Here's what I mean. I like doing them in a musical context for a couple of reasons, because we are, of course, working on clarity, intonation, resonance, projection, and voicing, or the coloration of the sound. Now, I use folk songs for my students because they're public domain. You can use any copyrighted song you want. I just can't give it to you. But it's doing a tone study in the key of whatever you're studying that month and then putting it in different keys. But what a good folk melody or a good melodic line is going to do is give us more use for flexibility, phrasing, vibrato, and also a nice mix of stepwise and leaps in motion. And this is where I don't like to think of long tones as long tones so much as tone studies with melodies. The way we perceive tone is largely a result of the initial attack and the release of the note. If you were to record a tenor saxophone and a bassoon playing the same pitch, a long note, and you were to chop off the beginning and the end, it's actually pretty difficult to tell the difference between the two instruments, not the players. So what we want to do is, in studying tone studies, we're addressing the start and the ending and the transition between notes, not just the long middle section. We, of course, have to control that, but if I'm doing melodic studies with folk tunes, or any tune of your choice, which is slow and you can focus on the transitions, the start, the articulation, the coloration of the front of the note is highly important. We have many options in the free fundamentals book, of course, you can check out down below, or use your own. There's no magic to which tune you're doing, but you should vary it to a point where you don't get bored and it goes on automatic pilot. I have a few that I cycle through with my students, and every now and then I'll add in something myself. You can be creative, but studying a tone study, I like to prefer that, to think of that instead of a just long tone, holding one long tone for a period of time. So tone studies, again, I have exercises on this and videos on this, and I'll cover it even more in future videos. But a tone study is going to be great after exercise 0, after you've set your embouchure, your airstream, relax the body. Next, overtones. And here's a little bit of variety we can play with. Sometimes I practice overtones before the tone studies, sometimes after. I don't roll a dice, it's kind of how I'm feeling that day. So sometimes it's great to do overtones before tone studies because of what we learn in the voicings. Sometimes I'll intersperse overtone studies with the tone studies with tone matching, which I have entire videos on this. But here's the short of it. Overtones, I have my students practice them in a scale linear fashion first. Again, I have entire videos on this, but we finger the low pitch and sound the upper pitch on the exercises you're going to see. We play major scales using overtones. What this does is teach us voicing. In order to finger a low B flat but play F in a controlled manner, we have to learn how to shape our oral cavity, or what we call voicing. This is how we really lock in the coloration and have flexibility in our sound. And by learning to produce overtones, we learn the mechanism of voicing. And once you have it, you're going to be amazed at what you can do with your sound, flexibility, and the tonal colors you're able to pull. So here's the other thing that overtones for me are immensely fun to practice. Overtones really help with resonance, not just volume, not playing loudly, but I know you know what I'm talking about. Not to get into too much woo-woo here, but you ever play a note and it just kind of rings and kind of sings with the room, maybe the universe? Okay, probably not, but that resonant sound. So if you can play, for instance, F2 or F with octave key as an overtone of low B flat, then match that sensation when you're playing naturally fingered F. The clarity and resonance you're going to get out of that, and just the overall sensation, is highly alluring. Practice it for yourself and you'll see what I'm talking about. So, overtones to learn that voicing mechanism, to really unlock the resonance and clarity of the pitches. So sometimes I'll do an overtone study, then the melodic study, and match some of those. And again, that's in the overtone studies video. But overtones are a key part of what I practice in every session, sometimes before tone studies, sometimes with, and sometimes after. There's no magic secret to when you do it. Just make sure you're doing it. The second pillar of your practice, technique. Now, we will talk about this at the end of the video, but of course we also want to practice technique with good tone, but what we're doing is focusing our attention on one element. So technique, I like to break up into two parts outside of practicing etudes or improvisation, as we call artistry. But practicing technique, I want you to primarily focus on scales and key studies, and I'll explain. So first of all, scales. If I'm working on a jazz standard on a particular month with my students, I'll have them practice the full range, major scale, and variations of whatever key the tune we're working on that month. I like to kill as many birds with one stone as possible. Don't kill birds, just eat them. So what we want to do is pick the scale that we're going to be working on, an etude or a jazz standard in that key, spend some time with that. Now, once you have that mastered, make sure you are learning all your full range major scales. Again, they're all in the fundamentals book, which is free. And once you have all 12 major scales learned as kind of a landmark, then of course keep them up to snuff. But I don't practice all major scales every practice session full range. It's rather time consuming, and once you have kids and a business and all that, you need every second you can get. But what I will do is spend a little extra time with articulation patterns and variations of the scale for whatever tune I'm working on. And if I'm really practicing a couple of jazz standards that week, I'll practice those scales. But full range scales as a landmark, I want you to have all 12 major scales learned full range at, well, I can't give you an exact tempo because this is highly individual, but create a landmark for yourself. Then you can keep them up maybe once a week, maybe every other practice session, or do one of the major scale motions that is in the book that covers all 12 keys in a fast exercise, but really dial in on what's going to give you the most bang for the buck on what you're working on that week. So in addition to practicing scales and focusing on the scale of whatever jazz standard you're working on or whatever etude or classical piece, whatever key that is, I highly recommend going into key studies. And here's what I mean. Exercises related to the chord progression within that key, largely diatonic sevenths and diatonic sevenths with alternating motion. Again, all those exercises are in the free PDF. Now, diatonic sevenths are great for learning the diatonic chord progressions in a key. So when you do the diatonic sevenths in whatever key you're studying, you're learning the 1 chord, the minor 2 chord, the 5 chord, the minor 6 chord, all the chords within that key area. And also, likewise, if you're studying a minor key, you're getting that half diminished chord, you're getting the 5 chord that's altered with the flat 9, you're getting all the juicy chord progressions by practicing diatonic sevenths. So go through those before you start improvising over the jazz standard. You're going to find many of those chords you find, you already have those sounds under your fingers. Diatonic sevenths are incredibly powerful. Have I said hello in a while? It's been a while since I released a video. I've missed you guys. If you would, hit the like button for me. Make me feel really good. You know, feel saucy. Maybe you want to make another video later on. Kidding aside, we have some really fun things coming up in the coming weeks. We've got altered dominance. We've got a lesson on Coltrane. We've got a duet we're going to play together. So stick around. Fridays are going to be the release date going here on out for the rest of the summer. A lot of fun stuff planned. So please do hit that like button and stick around for me next week. Now, pillar number 3 is artistry. And this is where we take the other 2 elements and put them in context of making music. So this is where you're practicing your Glazunov concerto, your jazz standard, your jazz etudes, or learning to improvise, applying the tone and technique to a musical context. Now, before you dive in, I want you to just take a breath. Just take a moment of pause in your practice instead of diving right in. Relax the body, clear the mind, take a few deep breaths. Next, I want you to dive into your ear training and listening. Here's why. We only have a limited amount of attention and mental discipline in our lives, and I find transcription in jazz is one of the most mentally and emotionally at times taxing things we do in our playing. So after tone and technique, before we dive into the scales and the patterns or the licks that we're learning, take some time to do transcription, listening to the player you're trying to figure out and playing along. I have an entire video on transcription as well. I find this very mentally and at times emotionally taxing, and it's not easy for my students. Now, in my curriculum, I do break down ear training into little bite-sized chunks for my students. That's not easy either. So I recommend at the beginning of your artistry session, after you take a small breath, maybe a cup of tea, then dive into that with a fresh mind and with whatever willpower you have to be patient and kind to yourself. If this is new to you, it is very taxing. So do this next. Learn by ear whatever jazz standard or solo that you're learning that week. Now, next up, improvisation exercises, where we isolate one phrase that we're working on and practice it. Now, here's why I like to do this after the transcription. transcription involves listening to something again and again and again. For some of us, many times, if we're honest. And that's going to do a couple of things. Not only is the language going to be fresh in your mind, you'll have recently practiced it, there's so much information relayed through the music recording, the feel, the style, the inflection. It kind of seeps into your bones, metaphorically speaking. If it's actually seeping into your bones, you should see your doctor. But hearing the music, listening to a great recording, getting in that space, kind of walking in the shoes of your heroes before you start improvising has been a game changer in my own practice. So before you take that digital memorized pattern from Charlie Parker, transcribe some Charlie Parker, get the feel and the soul of that recording before you start applying it in your practice. Now, I recommend taking one phrase at a time. In Western music, most of Western music, Western like European American music, not like country Western. In most of Western music, a phrase is 4 bars. There are plenty of exceptions, of course, but generally look at that jazz standard. Take 4 bars at a time and improvise one phrase at a time before you tackle the entire thing. Improvise after you've done your listening and your ear training and your transcription. Your practice will be much hipper, I assure you. Now, at the end of your artistry session is where I recommend you do your literal learning, reading music. Now, it's something that's really important as a professional musician that played in military bands and many other decent paying gigs. Reading music was a big part of my job. I had to be able to read music accurately and fairly quickly. So it's a skill you should practice. Why I really like learning etudes for learning and also learning the stylistic things that are important when you sit in with a saxophone section or a symphonic band. So doing the reading last for me is very helpful because it's not as mentally taxing as ear training or transcription. You kind of follow the written instructions on the page, and part of my brain, okay, bear with me, part of my brain can turn off a little bit when I'm reading music. I put on my metronome, I practice slowly and fast, just reading the notation, getting under my fingers. Of course, I'm playing with the most beautiful tone I can, but for me, it's less mentally taxing than transcription. So whether you're playing the Iber Concerto or Rhythm and Changes Etude, that's when you put on your metronome and you do that kind of meditative work of learning slow to fast. And of course, then you add dynamics and all the musical trappings that you need to. But I like to keep that for the end of my practice session. And believe it or not, it kind of feels like dessert. After you've done the hard work of listening and learning to play a jazz solo by ear or learning a jazz standard by ear, reading the music kind of feels like a treat at the end and kind of relaxing. And then sometimes I'll go back and forth between playing the etude and improvising with what I'm learning. But I like to do the strictly reading slow to fast last in my practice session. Now, if you're a classical player and you're learning an etude or the Crescent Sonata or your Fairling etudes, Fairling, I'm never doing those again. If you're doing that, then that might take the place of your improvisation or transcription. When I was in high school and early college, that's the bulk of my practice time was spent doing that. And that's perfectly fine. But if you're going to do some ear training, please do it first. Now let's cover some contradictions, caveats, and questions. Number 1, shouldn't everything you play be a tone study, and shouldn't everything you play be a technical study? Yes, I don't argue with that at all, but we can direct our attention to something in particular. We can't focus on everything all at once all the time, especially when we're learning something. So when we're doing tone studies, of course, we want good, clean technique as we change pitches, but we're focusing on the tone. That's where our conscious attention is directed. Likewise, when we're doing tone studies or improvisation, of course, we want the best tone possible. We're just focusing on something else. That dividing your attention between many things at the same time is tough. If you're superhuman and can do it, great. I've yet to meet anyone that really can. So focus on one thing at a time in your artistry section. You can put them all together. Number 2, you don't have an hour to practice, like many of us. That's perfectly fine, or you can't practice every day. If you don't have a full hour to practice, how do you fit it all in? You can't. That's okay. You don't have to do everything every day. So maybe one practice session, you have 5 minutes for technique. That's okay. You spend that time on scales. Maybe the next session, you do your diatonic sevenths. Maybe one week you do overtones, and the next week you spend a little bit more time on tone studies. You do not, please bring it in. You don't have to be perfect every practice session to make great progress. It's the consistent action of making progress that's going to lead to greatness, not perfection. So don't worry about it. Split it up, divide it however you can. We're all adults here. Use your best judgment. And if you have any questions specifically, hit me up in the comments. I'll do my best to answer it. Question number 3, what about insert exercise here? This great player that I know, or my teacher, or famous person X said, you got to do this exercise every day, and they recommend it. Great, do it. Great, teach it to me. Again, it's not the exact exercise. One of my biggest gripes with the online teaching zeitgeist is that there are great exercises that save you time and energy, and it's what the pros do, and there's things that are wasting time. I really disagree with that whole idea, and it's contrary to my philosophy. There are infinite numbers of exercises you can play to get the same result. I give you an outline of what I do to take too much of the questioning mind off the table. You have to start somewhere and then develop a routine, but you have to start with a good landmark practice session first. Past there, you can add in any number of exercises and they're all going to be helpful. I truly don't view any exercise, as long as it's not hurting you physically, as a waste of time or not making progress. And the best players I know, they love doing exercises for the feel and the sound. The best players I know love tone studies. Regardless of if it would make them better, though it does, it's because it's the study, it's the path, it's the travel towards that destination should be enjoyable. So there are infinite number of exercises that will work. Don't fret that you're doing the wrong one and someone else said you got to do this exercise but not that one, or this is a waste of time, or this one's great. Yes, I have my preferences, but progress is progress. Trust me. Now, I want to hear from you, first of all, questions about anything I've talked about, or if you need help finding a specific video that I've referenced, let me know in the comments below. I'm going to do my best to dig it up. Maybe in the community we can help each other out. But also I want to know, what are the exercises that have taken you to the next level, have really given you huge gains in your playing? And maybe even this, what are some exercises that you love to do even if they didn't make progress? And I think you might know what I'm talking about. What is something that is so enjoyable to do is an exercise you'll never give up? I have several of those. So let me know in the comments below. Next week, and again, we are getting on a regular schedule. Next week, I will see you with Stepping Out with Altered Dominance. It's going to be a fun, very dense masterclass in both theory and practice. Bring your saxophone. I also have a PDF with all the exercises you'll need. So I will see you next Friday. Have a fantastic week, and it's good to see you again. Now go practice.